The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of a quiet side street in Norfolk, Virginia. Inside, the daily grind. A small, unassuming coffee shop, the air was thick with the aroma of roasted beans and the low hum of conversation. Sunlight streamed through the large front window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and falling on a handful of patrons. At a small table by the window sat a woman named Sarah Jenkins. To anyone glancing in from the street, and her eyes were fixed on the screen of a well-worn laptop. A half-empty mug of black coffee sat beside her, long gone cold. She tapped at the keyboard slowly, occasionally pausing to stare out the window. A faint, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. She looked like a grad student wrestling with a thesis, a freelance writer on a deadline, or perhaps someone just passing time. No one paid her any mind. Behind the counter, a young barista named Chloe was wiping down the espresso machine, her earbuds in, lost in her own world. The only other customers were an elderly man deeply engrossed in a newspaper and a young mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained in the corner. It was a picture of perfect, mundane tranquility. But the peace was about to be shattered. The bell above the door chimed, a tinkling sound that was instantly at odds with the two men who walked in. They weren't the usual clientele. Both were in their mid-20s, wearing dark, heavy hoodies with the hoods up, despite the mild weather outside. Their movements were jerky, their eyes scanning the room with a furtive, nervous energy that set off silent alarms. The taller one, with a patchy beard, shoved his hands deep in his pockets. The other, shorter and stockier, kept his hand clenched tightly inside his hoodie, creating a telltale bulge. Chloe looked up, pulling out one earbud. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" The two men ignored her. The taller one walked to the center of the room and pulled his hand from his pocket. It wasn't holding cash for a latte. It was holding a black, semi-automatic pistol. He didn't point it at anyone, just let it hang by his side, a clear and present threat. "All right, listen up," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. This is a robbery. Phones on the tables. Now!" The spell of normalcy was shattered. The elderly man's newspaper rustled as his hands began to tremble. The young mother instinctively curled her body around her child, a small whimper escaping her lips. Chloe froze, her face draining of all color. Her eyes darted towards a silent alarm button under the counter, but it was miles away, an impossible reach. And echoed in the sudden silence. Sarah echoed in the sudden silence. Sarah Jenkins didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. Her reaction was so subtle that no one noticed. Her fingers, which had been resting limply on the keyboard, slowly curled, her knuckles whitening for just a fraction of a second before relaxing. The unfocused, weary look in her eyes vanished, replaced by a chilling stillness. It was the stillness of a predator assessing a new threat, a deep-sea diver holding their breath. She didn't look at the men directly, but tracked their reflections in the black glass of her laptop screen, cataloging every detail, their stance, their weapon, the position of their hands, the exits. The taller man, the apparent leader, strode towards the counter, waving the gun at Chloe. "You, open the register. Put all the bills in a bag, now. No funny stuff." Chloe, scoop them up. "Hurry up!" The man scooped them up. "Hurry up!" The man snarled. Meanwhile, the shorter man by the door started getting antsy. His eyes, wide and darting, scanned the patrons. They landed on the young mother, then slid to the elderly man who was fumbling with his phone, trying to hide it under his newspaper. "Hey!" the shorter man yelled, his voice high-pitched with adrenaline. And he pointed a stubby finger at the old man. "I said phones on the table, Grandpa. You think I'm playing?" He took 2 aggressive steps forward, revealing the handle of a knife tucked into his waistband. The old man dropped his phone as if it were on fire. I'm sorry, please." The scene was spiraling. The leader was focused on the register, the second man was becoming increasingly agitated, and the tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. And they were amateurs, unpredictable, and that made them exponentially more dangerous. A panicked amateur with a gun is a walking tragedy waiting to happen. Sarah made a decision. It wasn't a conscious, heroic choice that flashed before her eyes. It was a process, a series of rapid tactical calculations drilled into her over a decade of service. Target 1 is the primary threat. Weapon in hand, 14 feet away. Target 2 is secondary. Knife, 7 feet from target 1. Civilians in the line of fire. Need to collapse the distance. Need to control the space. Neutralize the weapon first. Her body, which moments ago seemed soft and unassuming, was now coiled like a spring. The transformation was not physical, but postural. She sat up, her shoulders squared, her feet planted flat on the floor beneath her. Her right hand slid from the table into her lap, resting on her thigh. The leader got his bag of cash from the terrified Chloe. Good. Now, everyone's wallets and purses. Throw them on the floor in the middle. He gestured with the gun. You, he said, pointing it directly at Sarah. You start. Get your purse. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were not filled with the fear he expected and craved. They were calm, clear, and held a terrifyingly absolute focus. He saw it, a flicker of something wrong, but before his brain could process the anomaly, she moved. It wasn't fast. It was immediate. And there was no transition. 1 second she was sitting, the next she was in motion. She didn't stand up, she exploded upwards, her left hand sweeping the laptop and coffee mug off the table in one violent motion, sending them crashing towards the gunman as a distraction. In the same fluid instant, her right hand, the one that had been resting in her lap, came up. It wasn't empty. It now held a small, matte black pistol, drawn from an ankle holster hidden beneath her loose jeans. The leader's eyes went wide, his gun hand starting to swing towards her. He was too slow. The gap closed. Sarah's forward momentum was a controlled avalanche. Her left hand, now free, shot out and clamped onto the slide of his pistol, locking the action so it couldn't fire, simultaneously pushing it away from her body and towards the ceiling. Her right hand, with her own weapon, came up in a tight, efficient arc, the muzzle pressing firmly against the soft tissue under his chin. Drop it," she said. Her voice was quiet, utterly devoid of bravado or panic. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as gravity. It was the voice of someone who had been in this exact position more times than most people could imagine, in places far more hostile than a coffee shop. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. The leader froze, his brain short-circuiting. One moment he was in control, the next, a woman he had dismissed as a nobody had him dead to rights. And he felt the cold, unyielding circle of steel against his throat and saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. He knew, with a primal, gut-wrenching certainty, that if he so much as twitched, she would pull the trigger without a second's hesitation. His gun clattered to the floor. The shorter man by the door finally reacted. He saw his partner disarmed and let out a strangled yell, pulling the knife from his waistband. He was 15 feet away, a clumsy, loping charge. Sarah saw him in her peripheral vision. She didn't flinch, didn't take her eyes or her gun off the primary target. In one fluid motion, she shifted her weight, brought her left leg up, and delivered a devastating side kick to the leader's solar plexus, sending him flying backward into a table, which collapsed under him with a crash of splintering wood and ceramic. The move created the necessary separation. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, a perfect, an economical turn that brought her to face the oncoming threat. The man with the knife was 5 feet away, his face a mask of rage and fear. He lunged, Sarah didn't move back. She moved forward, inside the arc of his clumsy stab. Her left hand shot out, deflecting his knife hand wide with a sharp, bone-jarring slap. At the same time, her right hand, still holding her own weapon, came across her body in a short, brutal arc. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. The butt of her pistol connected with the side of his temple with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head and his legs buckled. He crumpled to the floor like a sack of potatoes, the knife skittering away under a table. Silence. A profound, ringing silence descended on the cafe, broken only by the ragged, terrified sobs of the young mother and the metallic squeak of a chair as the elderly man pushed himself further back against the wall. The entire violent symphony had lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, breathing evenly. She looked down at the two men. The leader was groaning, clutching his chest, trying to crawl away. The other was completely unconscious. She holstered her weapon with a smooth, practiced motion, the small pistol disappearing back into its ankle holster, as if it had never been there. She pulled her phone from her back pocket. 911. Hi, what's your emergency? I need police and an ambulance at the Daily Grind on 4th Street. 2 down, 1 with a possible concussion, the other with potential internal injuries. Situation is secure. No further threat. She gave her name and location with the same calm efficiency with which she had just disabled 2 armed men. She ended the call and looked around the room. The spell was broken. Chloe was staring at her, mouth agape, tears streaming down her face. And the young mother was just shaking, clutching her toddler who had started to cry. The elderly man was looking at her with a mixture of awe and utter disbelief. Sarah walked over to Chloe. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Chloe shook her head, mute. She finally managed to stammer, Who are you? Sarah just offered a small, reassuring smile. It was a different smile from before, warmer, more human. I'm Sarah, she said simply. Can you get me some paper towels? I think I made a mess with my coffee. The nonchalance of the request was so startling, so profoundly out of place, that Chloe let out a choked laugh, a release of tension. She nodded and went to get the paper towels. Sarah then knelt by the unconscious man, checking his pulse. Strong and steady. He'd have a hell of a headache, but he'd live. She then walked over to the leader, who was now moaning in earnest. She didn't touch him, just stood over him, her presence alone enough to keep him pinned to the floor. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and terror. What are you? He whispered, his voice raspy. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. The sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. The police were a minute out. The quiet civilian was gone. In her place stood a warrior, cloaked in a stillness born of countless operations. I love staring down death in dusty villages and dark alleys on the other side of the world. She didn't answer his question. She didn't need to. The answer was written in the devastatingly precise movements of the last 30 seconds, in the calm, tactical assessment in her eyes, in the way she had neutralized a threat not with rage, but with the detached professionalism of a master craftswoman. The first police cruiser screeched to a halt outside. A scene that made them all do a double take. 2 men down, a terrified barista, and a woman in a gray sweatshirt calmly dabbing coffee off the floor with paper towels. Hands! Show me your hands! An officer shouted, his weapon trained on Sarah, the only person moving. Sarah slowly stood up, her hands raised to shoulder height, palms open. I'm the one who called it in, she said calmly. The 2 on the floor are the subjects. The weapon on the floor by the table is his. She nodded towards the leader's discarded pistol. I am legally permitted to carry. My identification is in my back left pocket. The lead officer, a grizzled sergeant, approached her cautiously. Something in her posture, her calm, her precise wording, told him this was no ordinary witness. He holstered his weapon and carefully retrieved her ID. It was a standard Virginia driver's license, Sarah Jenkins. The address was a P.O. box. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what happened here?" Before she could answer, another officer called out from near the unconscious man. "Sarge, this guy's got a knot on his head the size of an egg, and he's out cold." The sergeant looked from the man on the floor to the discarded pistol to the calm woman in front of him. "Ma'am?" Sarah met his gaze. "See, he came at me with a knife after I disarmed his partner. I defended myself." The word disarmed hung in the air. It was a word civilians used, but the way she said it, the way it was simply a matter of fact, suggested a context the sergeant was beginning to understand. Over the next hour, as paramedics treated the injured men and officers took statements, the full, incredible picture began to emerge from the terrified, awestruck witnesses. Chloe, between sobs, "I told them about the lightning-fast disarm." The elderly man, now sipping water from a trembling hand, described the kick as something from a movie. The young mother just kept repeating, "She saved us. She saved my baby." The sergeant finally approached Sarah, who was sitting at an overturned table, giving her formal statement to a young detective. The detective looked up at his boss, his expression one of profound respect and a little disbelief. He had already run a preliminary check on the name. "Sarge," he said quietly, handing him a tablet. The sergeant read the screen. The name Sarah Jenkins was a placeholder. The file was sparse, heavily redacted, but the core information was clear. It listed her status as a discharged veteran, but the nature of her service was blacked out. However, the record was flagged with keywords that told a story of their own. Multiple overseas deployments, or a slew of medals including a Bronze Star with a V for valor and a unit designation that the sergeant immediately recognized, SEAL Team 6, the most clandestine and elite counter-terrorism unit in the world. The sergeant looked from the tablet to the woman on the upturned table. She was no longer a simple victim. She was a ghost, a shadow warrior who had stepped out of the darkness and into the mundane light of a coffee shop. He walked over to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying a new tone of deference. "We have the scene. You're free to go. We'll be in touch if we need anything further." Sarah nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant." She stood up, looking around the destroyed cafe. Chloe was being comforted by another officer. She caught Sarah's eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Sarah gave her a small nod. As she walked towards the door, the sergeant stopped her. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, they're but safe civilians. At the police officers, but safe civilians. At the police officers who were now looking at her with a new, awestruck respect. The ghost had been seen. "It was just situational awareness, Sergeant," she said quietly, "and a little training." She pushed open the door and stepped out into the bright Norfolk sun, leaving the shattered calm of the daily grind behind her and taking with her the secret of who she really was. The patrol officers and the detective watched her go, a simple woman in a gray sweatshirt, disappearing into the ordinary world, a world she had just for a few explosive seconds reminded them was anything but safe. They had believed she was a simple victim. Now they knew the truth, and it was a truth they would never, ever forget.